Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by once again discussing the coronavirus pandemic. And this time we're going to discuss, as we have previously as well, the vaccine distribution and the United Nations continuing concern about how vaccine distribution has already begun on a very unequal note across the world. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, criticizing what he's called, quote unquote, the wildly uneven and unfair distribution of these vaccines, pointing out that just 10 countries have administered, so far at least, 75% of all vaccinations. He's then said that 130 countries have not received even a single dose of the vaccines so far, and that less than 1% of the COVID-19 vaccines administered in 32 countries that are facing the most severe humanitarian crisis, 160 million plus, are at risk of being excluded altogether from vaccinations because they live in countries engulfed in conflict and instability. That is, for now at least, they've been excluded. This is, of course, of concern because there's a lot of discussion about mutations, etc., if the virus is still very much around anywhere in the world, and that, of course, then endangers citizens of any nation on Earth. Let's discuss all of those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Robert Field, who is a professor of law, health management, and policy at Drexel University. He's joining us this morning from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Joining us this morning from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, is Felipe de Carvalho, who is an MSF Access Campaign Coordinator in Brazil. Felipe and Robert, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us. Felipe, let me start with you. How concerning is it for MSF and for yourself that the distribution has been this unfair across the world so far?
It's very concerning. As you said, we have a lot of new challenges to discuss, for example, the new variants of the virus. And we have been saying that no one will be safe until everyone is safe. This pandemic will only be over when it's over for everyone, everywhere. So we really need to overcome this situation where we have a huge inequity in the distribution of vaccines and make sure that everyone gets vaccinated so we can control the pandemic. We think it's very problematic, for example, that many countries are not even being able to vaccinate frontline healthcare workers because the health systems in a lot of countries is already overwhelmed, and we really need to get at least healthcare workers vaccinated so health systems can keep functioning, and including to respond to other diseases that also have a huge demand. So we really see this as the result, as the consequence of decisions that have been made since the beginning of the pandemic, in which companies are not being transparent about their deals with governments. The multilateral cooperation is not working well. So there are many failures that are leading us to this situation, but there is still time to overcome these problems and make sure we have equitable access to vaccines.
Robert, all of this obviously is that much tougher because we're dealing with the fact that each nation's peoples would want the vaccines first, right? They want to be secured themselves. So, I mean, how does one, in your opinion, balance out then that very important political reality that all leaders around the world are dealing with, that their people want to be protected versus then protecting the rest of the world too?
Right. Well, I think politically, it's a no-win situation for the leader of a country. I couldn't imagine the U.S. president deciding to allocate vaccines when we've only immunized about 12% of the population. It would be politically suicide. I do think, though, that we've known this problem was coming for months, and there was really almost no effort to coordinate it globally. While the U.S. has played a behind-the-scenes role, we have not been very active, at least under our last administration. The EU has had an awful lot of trouble figuring out how to allocate vaccines. Russia and China have been out front using vaccines for diplomacy and trying to buy influence around the world. What we've really needed is global coordination. That's what a pandemic is, global. And the lack of U.S. leadership, I think, had a lot to do with the problem, but that nations of the world just knew the problem was coming and did nothing to try to plan for it.
Felipe, if I may put you on the spot for a moment, you're sitting in Brazil, and we know that there's issues with the leader there in that country itself, and his opinions on this entire virus, etc. How much of a challenge do you think that has been? As Robert there alluded to as well, we can probably name Trump as well amongst the same group of leaders who, at the beginning at least, were slow on the uptake when it came to responding to this virus to begin with. How much more of a challenge has that created than globally as well?
Well, of course, a response to a pandemic needs to be based on science and on decisions that prioritize public health. So in any country, this needs to happen. And we see that there was a failure in terms of political will coming from different places. But especially when it comes to vaccination, there was a lack of coordination amongst countries to do joint negotiations with pharmaceutical companies and impose some conditions. Because what we see today is that pharmaceutical companies have a lot of control of who gets vaccines, where, when, at which prices. And we are including seeing differences in prices between countries. For example, for the AstraZeneca vaccine, there were news reporting that Uganda is paying twice more than Europe for this vaccine. So this problem, it's also the fact that we lack governments getting together to negotiate together. And in the case of Brazil used to have a very strong leadership in global public health, in health diplomacy, especially when it comes to these topics of access, universal access. And in this pandemic, we are seeing that Brazil is stepping back from these previous positions in terms of leading discussions and trying to make sure that other countries also get access. So that's something that we are really concerned about.
Robert, one of the things that's come up in previous conversations on this topic that I've had is that of the concern of the pharmaceutical companies themselves, right? Those who are involved in the research and these vaccines production itself, and the fact that they are businesses, right, at their core. They want to make money somehow. And I know that, yes, a lot of them have used taxpayer monies of various nations to be able to, get these vaccines going. How do you think is it even possible really to balance out the business interests versus global interests in this regard?
Well, this is a classic example of where market doesn't work. When you're talking about dealing with a public good, which is vaccination for the entire world, you can't rely solely on competing companies that ultimately have a profit motive. As you pointed out, the companies that develop vaccines in the United States took money from the U.S. This is a public-private partnership, whether it was Operation Warp Speed or advanced purchase commitments. This is not solely a privately developed product. And so we could have been, we as the U.S. government, more aggressive in demanding allocations and other upfront commitments in return for the billions of dollars that we poured in. You see the companies behaving as you would expect them to behave, playing off nations against one another, trying to get the highest price, trying to send vaccines to the highest bidder, and that isn't going to work in a situation like this. I think that we have learned many of us have learned a lesson. Hopefully the world has learned a lesson that we need better coordination, and that while the private sector is wonderful for innovation and manufacturing, it has to work in line with public commitments. One thing the U.S. could be doing is working with other countries to give them the manufacturing capability to build the vaccines on their own. Playing with patent laws, going through the WTO, making sure that they're not only manufactured in the West and developed countries. We're not going to get enough supply in the U.S. to share it for months or maybe even for more than a year. But what we can do is teaching other countries to make it themselves. And ultimately, that's going to be a win-win for everyone.
Felipe, the final word before I let both of you go. One of the things that concerns me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, is that when we're talking about, there's been a lot of talk in various nations about vaccine passports of some sort, right? Where you prove that you've had a vaccine and therefore you can enter the country or you're able to move around more freely, et cetera, right? Is there a danger that we're going to create then a double tier or several tier society around the world where, there'll be huge swathes of the world which will almost be cut off then from traveling to various nations because of that, and that then will create its own set of inequalities, won't it?
Yeah, before coming to that, I just would like to react to what my colleague just said, because
Sure.
I think when we see the situation of where we have like business as usual playing out, we have the situation of exclusivity over the technologies like vaccines, but many others like treatment and diagnostics. Then we have scarcity because there is no sufficient production, and we have exclusion of populations. And this causes, of course, suffering and a lot of problems in the healthcare system. So to overcome that, as he said, like sharing the knowledge is the most important thing we have to do. And we have been asking since last year, first for companies not to request patents over these vaccines and technologies. They have not done so, of course. They have asked for a lot of patents, actually. We also requested COVAX and the multilateral coordination mechanisms to be more bold in terms of imposing to the companies conditions of sharing technology, of being transparent. And this has not happened. So now what is at stake is that WTO, the World Trade Organization, there is a proposal, and Pakistan is one of the proponents of a temporary suspension of intellectual property rights like patents over COVID technologies and other technologies like vaccines and diagnostics and treatments. Yeah. So this is very important to happen, because this would help, of course, more countries to start production, and then we can overcome the scarcity and the exclusion. We don't need to reach the situation where people need to be segregated because they have or they don't have vaccination. And of course, this can be an attempt to control travels, but we know the virus travels on its own way. So we don't think this is something reasonable from a public health point of view. What is reasonable is really to get universal access to vaccination, and there are political ways of promoting it. And the proposal at WTO is one of the strongest options we have today.
Well, we'll leave it there at that, but we sincerely appreciate both Robert and Felipe for taking their time out this morning, respectively speaking to us from Philadelphia and Rio de Janeiro, sharing their expert insight with us about the UN Chief Antonio Guterres' warning and criticism, really, about the very uneven fashion in which vaccines are being distributed around the world. He's spoken about this a number of times now, mind you, and so have WHO officials and other UN body officials as well. It is, quite a fair point to be making, considering doctors and medical officials keep saying that as long as the virus remains anywhere in the world, there will always be a danger for more variants to come up, and then for these respective vaccines to not be able to deal with those variants, even in countries which have been possibly even fully vaccinated. So the danger will always remain unless we deal with this in a completely global fashion, ensuring that everybody is vaccinated in an equal fashion, so that all of us then are able to be safe and able to travel safely and live in health as well. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar, Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss a survey that was conducted by the Middle East Scholar Barometer of Middle East experts, and it found that around 67% of respondents say that the foreign policy strategy was most likely to produce quote-unquote favorable results for the United States, that is, under President Biden, would be to return immediately to the JCPOA, which is the Iran nuclear deal, before negotiating other conditions with Iran. And of course, there are a host of other conditions that many parties want to add on, be it ballistic missiles, Iran's regional activities, etc. Nevertheless, these experts saying that let's enter the JCPOA, we re-enter the JCPOA, I should say, first, and then, I imagine, tackle the other issues which there are grievances with Iran with. Only 4% of experts that were surveyed by the Middle East Scholar Barometer were in favor of continuing what Donald Trump termed the maximum pressure strategy on Iran. Let's put that now to our panelists who are joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. We're joined by Dr. Neda Bolourchi, who is a postdoctoral assistant professor at Rutgers University. Joining us from Arlington, Virginia is Yousof Azizi, who is a research analyst in U.S. foreign policy decision-making and a PhD candidate in public administration at Virginia Tech. Yousof and Neda, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us. Neda, let me start with you. 67% is a fairly significant number of experts who would want the U.S. to rejoin the JCPOA without more conditions added on. I wonder, though, how realistic that really is, considering the various pressures both from allies and within the country that Biden is probably facing.
Well, as we've seen, it's not particularly realistic. It is based, I think, largely on historic law and what the United States has done in the past, and what scholars really think is the most efficient way to get moving forward with Iran. That you have to use the JCPOA as the foundation to actually address those bigger regional as well as great power competition issues that are out there. And so while the Biden administration is clearly showing that's not where it's going, scholars are really relying on what has historically been done as well as what's practically efficient in answering that. And then just on a slightly more methodological point here, in that survey, scholars weren't really given too many options, right? And so you're at an extreme of immediately rejoin or continue with the Trump administration. And so while there is solid reasoning for choosing immediately rejoining, the options in between are a little sparse.
That's a very good point. The polls are always, there's always something left that one leaves to be desired when it comes to such surveys. But Yousof, I wonder, there's obviously been movement in regards to the nuclear deal, right? Over the past 24 hours, we've had the U.S. express interest in joining talks with its European partners and possibly even Iran vis-a-vis the nuclear deal and efforts to try to save it. The Iranians, as you know, have given a deadline of the 21st, 22nd for movement on the issue of sanctions. In such a brief period of time, are the Iranians likely to get what they want?
So let me, before answering your question, I mentioned that in the same survey, as you described, 75% of the Middle Eastern scholars believe U.S. returning to the JCPOA make it less likely Iran gets a nuclear weapon in the next 10 years. So in answering your question, I would like to separate two issues. First, we have to look back when the Obama administration want to seek to have negotiation with Iran, engaging Iran in these issues. Because among all files and problems between Iran and the Western countries, especially the United States, the Iran nuclear case had the capacity and capability to gather all members of the United Nations Security Council to address it. I mean that to make sure that Iran never ever goes to get a nuclear bomb. Russia and China are on the same page as Europeans and Americans. So we cannot find any other files, any other issues against Iran that encourages international cooperation, especially among the members of the United Nations Security Council. So addressing Iran's nuclear program became a priority for the U.S. and its allies in Europe and even in the region. So I can also add that Iranians themselves want to peacefully address this crisis if the rights to have a civilian nuclear program preserved. So if we think of this atmosphere that all peoples want to peacefully in doing addressing the Iran nuclear program in a diplomatic manner, so it could be the first step to broaden the negotiation with Iran over other issues in the regions, regional security and other other mutual concerns.
Right.
So because of that, I think that these scholars believe that, rejoining as soon as possible with Iran to the JCPOA and encouraging Iran to address other issues would be the best option for the United States.
But Neda, there is this huge domestic reality, right, on the ground in Iran, where the economy is not doing very well as we speak, certainly, and that obviously adds significant pressure upon the Rouhani administration, which is on its way out fairly soon this year. But nevertheless, I mean, that window is also closing, right, where if Rouhani were to leave office, we don't know who will come in next as the president of Iran and how willing he would be as president to really renegotiate, if that is what's required or desired by the Western countries, or even just get back into the JCPOA as the rest of the parties would want. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there are at least two or three things that we have to sort of speak about in addressing that question. One is what came out yesterday is not a substantive change in terms of what the Iranians were expecting. For the United States to say that it's open to and will return to possible negotiations is not the tangible step that Iran wanted to see ahead of that February 21st deadline. And so what the response is, I think the Iranians are clearly looking for a Jim Baker here, not, they're not looking to prolong the discussions or a re-entry into the JCPOA. They're looking to get down to doing the actual work that's entailed in diplomacy and negotiations. In terms of the Rouhani administration, that is part of why maybe the Biden administration is somewhat hesitant, in addition to all of the lobbying that's going on and the larger regional concerns about the JCPOA. And so the question that is being asked is, well, even if we work with the administration, the Rouhani administration that brought us the JCPOA, these are the known bureaucrats on the Iranian side, what does it mean after June? And what they really mean is August, because the Iranian president won't be seated until August. And so here's the thing that you have to remember is that none of these things happen without Khamenei's approval and explicit direction. And so he has already said that returning to the JCPOA is the ultimate goal, right? And in essence, that's his declaration on it. So this hesitation over do we return in the sense of we don't know who we're going to be dealing with in 6 months, you actually may want to, in fact, get Iran back into the JCPOA. The United States wants to return to compliance because you will want to have already set the table when a new administration comes in. Right. And so between having returned to the JCPOA and having this direction from the supreme leader, then that actually kind of corners what will probably be a right of center Iranian president. As we've seen with the Iranian parliament already, the populace has started moving towards the conservatives and the right side. So not returning to the JCPOA, the United States is actually giving leverage to the conservatives and the right in Iran. And for people who have not been in Iran or in the Middle East, let's be clear, there is a difference between the center and the reformists and the right. Yep. On the ground, there are very practical differences. So for people out there who want to say there's not a difference, there is. And so the Biden administration not working to come into compliance or further compliance with the JCPOA is actually helping the right in Iran, and that will impact the Iranian presidential elections. And then in addition to that, it's an additional 6 months in which Iran will be advancing its nuclear program, August.
So Neda, I do apologize. I'm going to cut you off. I do sincerely apologize. We're just quickly running out of time. Yousof, we just have about a minute left. Tell me about your view on the domestic Iranian politics and how that will affect everything going forward.
First of all, under the JCPOA, the structure of UN sanction and unilateral US sanction did not disappear. So the three-year mechanism, the snapback mechanism, and US hegemony were practically granting that the US could immediately impose the same sanction structure before 2013 on Iran. So, but Iran did not have any guarantee, So after what Trump did to this agreement, it is logical to say that who has to fully come back to its obligation first under the negotiation. So Iranian wants to have, to release all its frozen assets outside Iran. They want to have connected to international financial system. They want to sell their oil freely without any restriction. So if all of these preserve, I think any faction, Rouhani or other, or a so-called hardliner, anyone wants to rejoin to JCPOA as soon as possible. So there is no difference between Iranians, but all of them want to see that the Western country, the other side of the deal, they do their obligation, that Iranian also will do their obligation.
Very well.
I don't agree that the domestic politics of Iran would heavily affect the international negotiation that Iranian Iranians do. As you said, that there is some hierarchy under the Iranian negotiation team, the Supreme National Security Council under the Supreme Leaders. So it is very different from the American domestic politics who affects the international negotiation.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that, but we sincerely appreciate both Yousof and Neda for their time this morning and for shedding light for myself and our viewers about where possibly, again, we may head when it comes to efforts for the United States to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal and possibly even in the Iranian eyes lift the sanctions that, again, arguably were never really lifted if we're talking about banking sanctions more specifically. Will Middle East experts get their wish for the U.S. to re-enter the JCPOA without adding conditions about other concerns that the U.S. and other parties have vis-a-vis Iran's activities beyond, of course, the nuclear energy program? That, again, is a wait-and-see game. The meeting will be taking place very soon, at least between the European powers. The U.S. has said it may very well join that meeting as well. So we will wait and see and keep a close eye on how those developments play out. The 21st, 22nd deadline that Iran has placed is coming up very soon. So really, it is a ticking time clock, right? It's the alarm clock is about to go off very, very soon on that, at least in the Iranians' eyes, unless there's an extension that satisfies them. I'll leave it there for now. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar, Rizvi. And on this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the ongoing controversy between Facebook and Australia's government. And of course, this does not just affect Australians, if we're completely honest, but we've had global governments also react to Facebook's move to block Australians from viewing news content in the respective timelines, etc. It also had blocked, and I believe it still possibly has blocked a number of pages, more official pages, including emergency pages to do with medical care, etc. as well, official Australian pages, that is. This is all because Facebook is unhappy, as was Google, of course, as we know, with a law that is to come into place in Australia that would ensure that these tech giants pay media publishing agencies for their content as well to ensure that their revenue is not hurt. Now, Facebook, of course, has its arguments for why it should be allowed to continue with the business model as it currently stands, but nevertheless, this very, very drastic measure to block news content from all Australians seems possibly like a step too far. I mean, there's a whole bunch of issues at play here, right? Democracy, the right to information, et cetera, et cetera. Let's put all of those issues to our esteemed panelists who are joining us this evening from Australia. We're joined now by Dr. Rupert Ackland, who is a professor at the School of Sociology at Australian National University. He has 20 years experience researching society and economy and the digital age. He's joining us today from Canberra. Joining us today from Brisbane is Dr. Terry Flew, who is a professor of digital communication and culture at the University of Sydney. Terry and Robert, good evening to you both, and thank you for joining us here in Scope. Robert, let me start with you. How did you react to Facebook's move?
Well, I think it was in some ways a bit of an own goal. However, I also think the reaction in Australia by the government to what Facebook did. I think Facebook should have started by just focusing on news media. Instead, what they took out were government and also some community information pages, and that's what's caused quite a lot of outrage. But I also think in some ways a lot of the outrage, I'm hearing it through the news media, and that they have a conflict of interest in reporting this issue. I'm also hearing it through the government, what's being said in Parliament, and there's quite a lot of performance going on by the government. It's a very popular kind of move with bipartisan support. So I think it's an own goal by Facebook, but I also think the reaction is quite extreme. But also I think it's potentially a very significant event.
Terry, what are your thoughts about this? You know, the words being thrown around are, access to information, democracy, et cetera. Do you agree with that? Is that all under threat?
Well, I agree with Robert that it's a disaster for Facebook in Australia, and I think Facebook is significantly underestimating the strategic significance of Australia. My sense is that Facebook has gone down the path that it has in order to send out a warning to other countries not to mess with it in a regulatory sense. But the problem is, I think that this has further enhanced the likelihood of very significant regulations of Facebook and other digital platforms going forward. And I think this week was significant. And we are talking about a process that comes out of an inquiry that goes back to the beginning of 2018. And we've had 18 months to debate the ACCC's digital platform inquiry recommendations, and that report is considered to be gold standard in terms of its assessment of issues around the market power of platforms and its implications. But we have a situation where Google has reached agreement with major news publishers, which I think is very important to the sustainability of journalism going forward. But Facebook has effectively said that in the Australian context, there will be no longer be professionally produced news on its sites. And so what does that tell you about what sort of information, or perhaps more accurately misinformation, is going to circulate on Facebook? So I note, for instance, public health organisations, 250 arts organisations have had their Facebook pages blocked. So you can see just how far this is ranging. Yet a whole range of conspiracy theory sites and COVID misinformation sites and so on continue to cheerfully peddle what they do on the platform.
All right, so this is not obviously just limited to Australia, or the implications of this, I mean, Robert. What do you think this means for the rest of us as well? I mean, does this mean in some ways, you remember back when the financial crisis had happened in 2008, we had spoken about how certain banks were too big to fail, right? Do you think that in some ways that these tech giants have become too big for the good of the rest of us?
Well, I think that this could be sort of one of those watershed moments when, or at least it's providing further evidence that something has to be done. I think what we're seeing here in Australia at the moment, and as you said, it's got implications for other countries where Facebook and social media platforms are dominant, it's really a culmination of something that's been happening for many years. Basically, the social media platforms took away the ability of newspapers to act as platforms. They previously were platforms in the sense that their business model was connecting one side of the market, which is news readers, with the other side of the market, which was advertisers. And this was a very lucrative business model for newspapers. There's references to the rivers of gold of advertising money. And what happened was that the social media platforms reconfigured the provision and consumption of information. And what this has done is the news papers are no longer platforms. They are basically industries that are making news, but their main money is not through connecting readers with advertisers. Their main money is coming through subscriptions to their news. And what this has led to is news media organisations becoming more partisan because they don't have to appeal to a general population or general readership anymore. So what they do is they serve up news that what their readers want, and that has contributed to a partisan information environment. And I think that this media bargaining code is significant, and I think it's needed in the sense that I don't like the fact that I believe journalists deserve to be paid for the work that they do, and there is a problem here in terms of where the money is going. But it's a band-aid solution in a lot of ways. Yes, there's going to be some money going to News Corporation for journalism, but is that going to lead to a revival of public interest journalism in Australia? And I have doubts about that. I think there's something more fundamental going on about the dominance of digital platforms, and this gets back to your point that I think that something other than this has to occur. Yeah.
That's an interesting point, isn't it? And if I may, I don't want to pick on Murdoch, but I know that within Australia, Rupert Murdochs and his empire of media organizations loom very, very large, right? Do you think that his influence and his power is what is pushing the Australian government to enact possibly this law that is upcoming, or is this a much larger issue than that? I mean, does this go to the very core of the entire issue of how journalism, traditional journalism, is dying out worldwide anyhow, and digital is just taken over?
I think it would be impossible to ignore the significance of News Corporation in the Australian landscape, but I think that the issues go much deeper than that, and the roots of the inquiry into digital platforms came from looking at why was it that 30% of Australian journalism jobs disappeared between 2012 and 2017. An important part of that, as Robert was saying, is the reconfiguration of digital markets that has really uncoupled the production of news and the practice of journalism from the modes through which it's distributed and disseminated. And these are international questions. I think that the other thing that is going on is that for a long time, governments around the world have accepted the mantra that in a global information age, national governments need to be hands-off with regards to the internet, that, you know, any form of regulation could break the internet, as they would say. Well, unfortunately, over the last few years, a lot of people around the globe are looking at what's gone on online with fake news, with online harassment, with the stripping of the traditional news and media and creative industries, and say, well, maybe the system's already broken. And also that surely as citizens we should have some kind of a say about how platforms that operate within a territorial jurisdiction exist. And I don't necessarily buy the argument that, well, the internet's global, therefore you can't do anything at a local level. Well, banking and finance are global industries as well, but I couldn't imagine anyone accepting the proposition that foreign banks wouldn't be regulated in a country like Australia. So I think that there is a search for some sort of public interest rationale to achieve a greater degree of social responsibility on the part of digital platforms. And I think in that respect, Facebook simply saying, after what has been a 3-year process of reviewing news, well, we don't like the outcome, therefore we are blocking all news in Australia, should frankly terrify people in other countries around the world, because if Facebook can break Australia in this regard, many other countries will experience the same fate.
All right, we're quickly out of time, Robert. I'll just give you a minute, if I may, to conclude this conversation. Do you think, and there's been an argument, I know, especially in the U.S., about competition, right? Overall antitrust issues within the U.S., and I believe in other parts of the world as well, when it comes to these tech giants, and I'm speaking now beyond just Facebook, certainly. Do they need to be broken up?
Well, I personally have the view that the reason why the Australian government is in the situation that they're in currently, and this is not just the current government, it's successive governments, have really not known how to deal with the innovation, the amazing innovation that's taken place over the last 20 years. And it's transformed many aspects of our lives. And I think I agree with Terry that what governments did was they had a light touch to this, because things were moving too fast for them. But I feel that the services that Facebook and Twitter and other social media companies have become matured now, and they've become so important to so many aspects of our personal lives, but also government in terms of information provision. I actually think the shocking thing that's come out of what's happened in the last 24 hours is that we're in a situation apparently where a foreign-owned corporation can shut off websites or shut off access to websites, and that seems to have there's implications in terms of information supply chains or supply chain resilience when it comes to information. And I think that there is a potential need to look at a sort of a utility model, the industry is mature enough that perhaps that's it's become so important to so many aspects of our lives that that's perhaps what needs to happen.
We'll have to leave that as a final word, but we appreciate both Robert and Terry for taking their time out this evening to share their expert insight with us. We were speaking there about Facebook versus Australia, as I brought up in my introduction as well. What does Facebook blocking news content for Australians mean? Has Facebook gone too far? Or is the media and government in Australia making too much of this issue altogether? There are, of course, arguments both back and forth for this issue, but nevertheless, the reality is that media organizations in Australia versus the digital space that Facebook represents, they both want to ensure that they're making as much money as possible and protecting their own respective interests, right? Facebook seemingly is able to now work beyond government's controls, and we're talking about global governments at this time. It's gone against a huge government like Australia and said that, no, you can't pass a law which is meant to rein us in and is made to ensure that we do pay your publishers, your news publishers, that is, for the content that they produce and that we show on our respective site. Where will this all end up? What does this mean for the rest of us around the world? We, of course, all watch with bated breath. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.